Welcome to 1130. First tonight, 6 Bible verses, the first written around 6,000 years ago, have framed the way many Christians think about gay. Some attitudes have propelled the call to a life of abstinence, while other attitudes have driven the so-called ex-gay movement. But careful study of the literal Word of God raises serious question marks about the real intent of those 6 Bible verses, and what did they mean for gay and lesbian people who are in a real relationship with their Creator. So, putting it all together, what does God say about gay? Our London correspondent takes a closer look.
Perhaps more than any other issue of our time, in London and across the globe, the response of the mainstream church to the gay debate has alienated affected people from the Creator God, the Bible, church, and their own families. With most Christians believing that the Bible condemns all same-sex relationships. Taking the original Word of God as entirely authoritative, huge question marks exist today about the real context and intent of the relevant scriptures that appear in modern translations of the Bible. American Bible scholar and author Matthew Vines has intensively examined the 6 scriptures in the Bible that refer specifically to this issue and their place in the entire written Word of God.
There are 6 passages in the Bible that refer to same-sex behavior, 3 in the Old Testament and 3 in the New Testament. The most famous passage is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God sends 2 angels disguised as men into the city of Sodom, where the men of Sodom threaten to rape them. The angels blind the men, and God destroys the city. For centuries, this story was interpreted as God's judgment on same-sex relations. But the only form of same-sex behavior described is a threatened gang rape. Ezekiel 16:49 sums up the story's focus on violence and hostility toward strangers. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. In Leviticus 18:22, male same-sex intercourse is prohibited, and violators are to receive the death penalty. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Other things called abominations in the Old Testament include having sex during a woman's menstrual period, eating pork, rabbit, or shellfish, and charging interest on loans. But they're part of the Old Testament law code, which was fulfilled by Jesus. Hebrews 8:13 says that the old law is obsolete and aging. Romans 10 verse 4 says that Christ is the end of the law. So the Old Testament doesn't settle the issue for Christians. But let's look to the New Testament, which contains the longest reference to same-sex behavior in the Bible. In Romans 1 verses 26 and 27, people who turn away from God to worship idols are then turned over to their own lusts and vices. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Paul's words here are clearly negative, but the behavior he condemns is lustful. He makes no mention of love, commitment, or faithfulness. His description of same-sex behavior is based solely on a burst of excess and lust. In the ancient world, same-sex behavior mainly occurred between adult men and adolescent boys, between masters and their slaves, or in prostitution. Most of the men engaged in those practices were married to women, so same-sex behavior was widely seen as stemming from out-of-control lust, a vice of excess, like gluttony or drunkenness. And while Paul labels same-sex behavior unnatural, he says in 1 Corinthians 11:14 that for men to wear their hair long also goes against nature. And most Christians interpret that as a reference to cultural conventions. In the last 2 likely references to same-sex behavior in the Bible, 2 Greek words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, are included in lists of people who will not inherit God's kingdom. Many modern translators have rendered these terms as sweeping statements about gay people. But the concept of sexual orientation didn't even exist in the ancient world. Yes, Paul did not take a positive view of same-sex relations, but the context he was writing in is worlds apart from gay people in committed, monogamous relationships.
That's Matthew Vines, author of God and the Gay Christian, submitting that when the relevant scriptures are properly examined, it is well worth one's time to revisit the way in which each has been traditionally understood. In London, this is Gay BC reporting for 11:30.
That report from our London bureau.